Good evening. Tonight, we step into three unsettling stories where the line between documented history and the shadow of the uncanny grows thin. We begin on the battlefields of the world wars, where exhausted soldiers swore their lives were saved by comrades who had fallen long before. Then we drift back to the late 19th century to follow a madcap Arctic balloon venture, cries, romantic in spirit, mysterious in its end. And finally, we cross a pitiless desert to witness the first transcontinental expedition across Australia, where human error etched a tragic mark into the record. Before you settle in, tap like and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy dark history and the mysterious. And tell me where you're watching from tonight. It's always a joy to see how we connect from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, let the room grow quiet, and let's begin our journey. Number 1. Ghosts of the battlefield. Get lost, you bastards. No matter how hard he tried, sleep always eluded Will Bird. By now, a battle-hardened soldier, he still found it nearly impossible to rest on the front lines. However exhausted he became, a stray shell, the blare of a bugle, or even the careless snoring of a comrade could tear away any hope of slumber. Rats only made matters worse, gnawing at rations, biting men in their bunks, and tormenting those already deprived of rest. And yet, despite all of it, Will's eyelids began to grow heavy. Exhaustion had finally taken over. But then, what was this? The sudden appearance of an uninvited guest jolted him back to full awareness. His irritation deepened as he heard footsteps squelching through the mud, approaching his cot. Assuming it was a fellow soldier come to rouse him for sentry duty, Will braced himself for the inevitable. "Go away! What do you want? It's not my turn on watch. This is no summer." The face Will saw in the dim, flickering light of the dugout was not that of a comrade, at least not one from his unit. The man standing there, smiling down at him with an unnerving calm, was Steve, Will's older brother. Yet the sight filled Will with dread, for Steve had been killed in action more than 2 years earlier, and now he stood before him, as real as any living man. Steve quickly raised a hand to cover his brother's mouth, signaling for silence. In that stillness, Will could feel the warmth of the hand he thought long buried. Steve's eyes locked onto his, soft but commanding, and with the faintest of smiles he whispered only one phrase, "Gather your things and follow me." Without another word, Will did as he was told. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, he hurried after Steve. The two moved swiftly through the communication trenches, Steve's stride firm and unyielding. But with every step, called out repeatedly, asking questions, pleading for answers, but his brother never responded. He just pressed forward with a rigid, almost mechanical gait. At last, Steve turned sharply around a corner just a few paces ahead. Will rushed after him, but the trench was suddenly empty. "Steve? Steve?" There was nothing. No trace, no sound, only darkness and the lonely echo of his own voice. Drained of strength and spirit, Will collapsed against the earthen wall. For the first time on the front, sleep came easily. "Good grief, you're awake at last. Sleep well? I must be losing my mind." The memory of that uncanny encounter gnawed at him the next morning. He could find no logical explanation for what he had seen, the familiar face, the living warmth of his brother's hand. Was it merely a dream? A hallucination born of exhaustion and strain? There was no time to dwell. A new day had dawned, and war never paused for anyone. As he made his way back toward his dugout, a chill crept over him. Something was terribly wrong. The shelter where he had lain only hours earlier was gone, obliterated. The ground was littered with splintered timber, twisted metal, and the mangled bodies of his fellow soldiers. The dugout had been hit directly by a shell. No one inside had survived. Will stood frozen, horror and disbelief washing over him. Someone, or something, had spared his life that night. The dim glow of that lantern, the spectral warmth of his brother's hand, would remain etched in Will Bird's memory for the rest of his life. Years later, he would recount the story in a memoir published in 1968, titled "Ghosts Have Warm Hands." However implausible the tale might seem, military records and private letters suggest such encounters were far from unique. Reports of fallen comrades or long-dead relatives appearing to soldiers were surprisingly common. For many, these ghostly visitations brought a strange kind of comfort. Some saw them as final farewells, while for others, like Will, they were guardian figures, shielding loved ones from harm. Amid the despair of the Great War, such moments offered rare solace. To men raised in faith, the belief in an afterlife lent strength to endure the nightmare. Yet not every apparition carried hope. A few encounters were far more ominous. "My ammo's gone. Damn it, how many rounds have you got left?" "Not enough to last. Let's hope you shoot straighter than that last one, mate. If Tommy doesn't get back with supplies, we're done for." "Yeah, I reckon that's likely. Keep firing." The thin British line had endured relentless attacks all morning. Though they had taken the town only hours earlier, their victory came at staggering cost. Scattered among the ruins, the weary survivors dug in, desperate to hold against the German counterattack. It was in that haze of smoke and gunfire that 2 British soldiers witnessed something they would never forget. "Hold on. Who the hell is that woman? Get her off the street." The mysterious woman seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. She gave no response to the shouts of the soldiers, simply standing in silence, utterly unmoved by the chaos of battle raging all around. Her eyes fixed firmly upon the 2 British infantrymen. She looked almost absurdly out of place amid the gray ruins of the shattered town. An elderly woman in a brilliant blue dress, a bonnet upon her head, her face lined with age and her gaze heavy with weariness. The men were bewildered, and even the German guns seemed to falter. Does she even realize there's a war going on? Maybe she's shell-shocked. Whatever it is, we've got to get her out of there. All right, then what do we do? Let me think. Do you know any French? Why? There's a woman out there, caught between the lines. Come look for yourself. When another soldier peered through the haze and caught sight of the figure, his demeanor changed instantly. "No, I don't see her." His face drained of color, eyes wide with terror. Trembling, the young man rose and stepped into the open, ignoring the frantic cries of his comrades. The woman's cold, unwavering gaze never left him. "Tommy, this is Trunks do 3, but it was as though he heard nothing. Moving as if in a trance, he slowly removed his helmet and whispered words that chilled those nearby. "That's my mother. I think she's come to take me home." A moment later, a shell exploded. When the smoke lifted, there was nothing left but the lifeless body of the young soldier. The woman in the blue dress had vanished as suddenly as she appeared, as though she had dissolved into the fog that hung over the battlefield. The 2 remaining men were left in stunned silence, grieving for their comrade, yet haunted by the thought that he had somehow been carried away by the phantom. Throughout history, soldiers have clung to superstition and belief, and the Great War was no exception. Most of those who fought were ordinary laborers, men raised on folklore and rural traditions. The idea that unseen forces might hold sway over their fate was deeply ingrained, and when destiny seemed to send them a sign, they believed it must be heeded. A common example of such superstition was the soldier's talisman, AT, some small keepsake or scrap of clothing carried for luck. To lose it before an assault was often regarded as a death sentence. Yet there were times when fate itself appeared to intrude, delivering darker messages, ominous portents that death was near. Letters and diaries from the trenches are filled with such accounts, of men suddenly overcome by dread, convinced their end was at hand. Though calm by nature, they would retreat inward, detached from those around them, until a strange serenity set in. Too often, these forebodings proved tragically accurate. All right, 10 more minutes and then we rest. As a member of Australia's first tunnelling company, Corporal Albert Davey knew death intimately. These specially trained engineers performed some of the war's grimmest work, digging deep beneath no man's land, planting explosives beneath enemy trenches and strongholds, and attempting to blow apart entire lines. Working in suffocating spaces far underground, always in danger of detection and countermining, required an unusual kind of soldier, one with iron will and steady nerves. By all accounts, Davey was such a man. By October of 1918, he was a veteran of 2 years' service, having distinguished himself in countless underground missions. Brave and unyielding, he was admired by his comrades and respected by his officers. But in those final weeks of the war, the tunnelers had little left to do. The great Allied offensives of the 100 Days were finally breaking the 4-year stalemate, and with the shift to open, mobile warfare, the tunnelers now fought alongside the infantry. Hope was rising. Talk of an armistice spread from trench to trench. Men spoke of families, new careers, and the lives they would reclaim when it was all over. Yet in those very days, Corporal Davey grew uncharacteristically somber. When pressed, He admitted he could not explain it, only that the feeling was overwhelming, inescapable. He was certain his time had come. In his memoirs, Captain Oliver Holmes Woodward, who commanded the company, recalled a chilling exchange with Davy on the eve of an assault. The sappers were to advance with the infantry and construct a bridge across the Somme Canal for tanks to cross. As the men assembled, Davy approached his captain. "I have often heard of soldiers sensing disaster before it struck," Woodward wrote, "but this was the only time I saw it with my own eyes. Corporal Davy, one of the finest non-commissioned officers I had, asked me to hold his personal effects and send them to his wife if anything happened. I sternly told him not to be foolish, that we all face danger, and he must remain calm. But he replied, 'Captain, nothing you say can shake my certainty that I will die. Please, just do this for me.' To ease his mind, I agreed." Woodward watched as Davy melted back into the flow of uniforms. By dawn, he was dead, killed by shellfire as his unit waited for the order to go over the top. By temperament, Corporal Davy was steady and resolute. He was as brave a man as any who served, never once failing to accomplish his task. There was no sign of panic, no weakness that would explain his behavior that night. And yet, he knew. More than a century has passed since the guns fell silent, but the legends of the trenches still echo, fascinating historians and storytellers alike. When asked about these supernatural moments in later years, the veterans, older, wiser, never denied their accounts, nor altered them. Even as young men, scarred by war yet sharpened by it, they were not prone to fancy. They survived through keen observation, through an instinct honed to react to the slightest detail. So, what are we to make of the fact that such men, living weapons, trained to perfection, saw the faces of fallen comrades? How do we explain the visions that foretold their own deaths? Alas, that extraordinary generation has long since passed away, leaving behind only their testimony, their stories, their mysteries, of a war where men not only stared death in the face but perhaps glimpsed, for a fleeting moment, what lay beyond it. Number 2, the insane Arctic balloon expedition of 1897. At the dawn of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, /no, when nearly every other corner of the globe had already been mapped and claimed, 2 regions remained beyond the reach of human endeavor. One was Antarctica, destined to host some of the most brutal and infamous expeditions in history. The other lay at the opposite end of the Earth, the Arctic, and there, a very different kind of journey was conceived. Instead of ships, sled dogs, and long overland marches, one man was determined to reach the North Pole by hydrogen balloon. His adventure began in mystery and ended in much the same way. This is the story of André's Arctic balloon expedition. By the close of the 19th century, dozens of expeditions from across Europe and North America had surveyed and charted great swathes of the Arctic. Yet, Sweden, despite its northern latitude and proximity to the region, and despite the triumphs of its neighbor Norway, lagged behind in the polar race. Their attempts were largely failures. On the eve of the new century, one man believed he could elevate his homeland to the ranks of the great exploring nations. His name was Salomon August André, born October 18, 1854, in the town of Gränna, Sweden. At the age of 16, following the death of his father in 1870, André entered the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, graduating 4 years later as a mechanical engineer. Fascinated by machines from an early age, his true passion for ballooning was sparked during a trip to the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. On the voyage across the Atlantic, André carried with him a book on the trade winds, easy, steady east-to-west currents near the equator. Reading it, he struck upon an idea that would shape his life, that balloons might harness predictable winds to travel great distances, perhaps even to cross the ocean. In Philadelphia, he worked as an attendant at the Swedish Pavilion during the World's Fair. In his spare hours, he sought out John Wise, one of America's pioneering aeronauts. André longed to fly with him, but duty called him back to Sweden before the chance arose. Returning home, he opened a mechanical workshop in hopes of funding his own balloon, but the business failed and the work bored him. He later took a post as an assistant at his old institute before joining a scientific expedition to Spitsbergen, the largest island of the Svalbard archipelago. This was no ordinary excursion, but part of the first International Polar Year, an unprecedented collaboration of scientists from 11 nations. Tackling shared technical challenges, Andre represented Sweden, and his team's data was judged the most accurate of all. The experience elevated his reputation in scientific circles. Afterward, he took a position at Sweden's patent office, yet quietly, he nursed a vision of leading his own polar expedition. With his growing prestige, he persuaded a Stockholm newspaper magnate to finance a balloon, framing it as an investment in science and national pride. He christened the craft Svea, emanama meaning of the Swedes, and began immediate trials. Over the course of 9 flights, covering more than 1,500 kilometers, Svea proved durable but extremely difficult to control. It was repeatedly swept over open water or smashed against rocky ground. Once, winds carried Andre clear across the Baltic Sea, dropping him onto a Finnish beach. From these trials came his idea of dragging heavy ropes from the gondola to create friction and thus steer more effectively. He believed the weight and drag would slow the balloon, giving him some measure of control. Though imperfect, the method seemed to allow the balloon to drift more slowly than the prevailing winds. He even added small sails to help rotate the craft along its vertical axis. With each flight, he gained experience, learning to hold the balloon steady long enough to collect weather and wind data. By century's end, Norway continued to claim polar glory, while Sweden remained in the shadows. This only sharpened the desire of Swedish leaders and scientists to reclaim prestige. Andre, sensing his moment, stepped forward with his audacious plan. By the close of the 19th century, Sweden's polar record remained modest. While Norway continued to set milestone after milestone, Sweden seemed fated to stand on the sidelines. This stung both the government and the nation's scientific community, who longed to reclaim leadership within Scandinavia. Seizing the moment, Andre put himself forward. In 1895, addressing the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, he drew upon his experience with Svea and his natural gift for persuasion to paint a vivid picture of a hydrogen balloon voyage across the Arctic, called practical and revolutionary. He argued that while Svea was too small and limited, a larger craft could easily be built. Concerns about hydrogen leakage he dismissed outright, citing a French balloon that had lost virtually no gas over the course of an entire year. Moreover, he insisted that the Arctic summer offered ideal conditions: 24 hours of sunlight for uninterrupted scientific observation, and no need to anchor at night. In the end, enough were convinced. The Academy approved his proposal for 130,000 kronor, SS, roughly $1 million today. King Oscar II himself pledged an additional 30,000 from his private fortune. A quarter of this would go toward the balloon, the rest to provisions and equipment. Yet while Sweden rallied behind him, the international community scrutinized his scheme. Andre may have been his country's leading aeronaut, but abroad there were balloonists far more seasoned, and most regarded his methods with deep skepticism. Undeterred, Andre purchased the balloon he believed would carry him across the Arctic. Built in France, it stood nearly 30.5 meters high, 21.3 meters in diameter, and was christened Örnen, the Eagle. It was designed to lift Andre and 2 companions, along with a gondola fitted with bunks, provisions, and scientific instruments. Fully loaded, the craft weighed more than 2,700 kilograms. To complete its mission, it would need to remain aloft for at least 30 days. But from the outset, it became clear that the manufacturer's claims had been wildly optimistic. Tests revealed severe hydrogen leakage, even through fabrics sewn in triple layers, varnished, and reinforced with silk strips. Andre pressed on regardless. The first attempt to map the Arctic by aerial photography finally came in the summer of 1896, after more than a year of preparation. From a long list of qualified applicants, Andre chose Niels Gustaf Ekholm and Niels Strindberg to accompany him. Ekholm was a seasoned explorer, a respected meteorologist, and Andre's former superior during the Spitsbergen expedition years before. Strindberg, by contrast, was a brilliant young student, already noted for groundbreaking research in physics and chemistry. He was also a gifted photographer and inventor, having designed a weatherproof camera the team planned to use to capture detailed images of the Arctic landscape. Each man brought unique scientific skills, though aside from Ekholm, they were academics more than hardened adventurers. In truth, Andre placed little emphasis on physical endurance or survival training, convinced the voyage would proceed smoothly and without incident. During the months of preparation, progress appeared steady. Even the construction of the hydrogen plant, considered the most daunting technical hurdle, was completed with only minor setbacks. The team marveled at the comfort of the multi-deck gondola, soon to be their home in the skies above the polar sea. But Ekholm harbored doubts. He suspected the Eagle lacked the lifting power to remain aloft under its immense load. Conducting his own trials, he found alarming results. The balloon was losing between 41 and 68 kilograms of lift each day. At that rate, he calculated, it could remain airborne for only 15 to 17 days, far short of the 30 required not only to reach the pole, but to attempt a trans-Arctic crossing. As if the leakage were not enough, the expedition was plagued by contrary winds. Stationed on Danes Island in the Svalbard archipelago, they waited week after week while northerly gales swept down, the opposite of the southerlies they desperately needed. All of Sweden watched press, sponsors, public, Kress's stock, but as the weeks dragged on, the hope of departure seemed ever more remote. Ironically, their failure coincided with a Norwegian explorer's triumphant return, having spent 4 years in the Arctic and achieved a record northern latitude. After 6 fruitless weeks, even André conceded defeat. The launch would be postponed until the following year. Overnight, his image as pioneer and national savior collapsed. On the long voyage home, Ekholm learned a disturbing truth. The chief engineer at the hydrogen plant confided that André had secretly topped off the balloon with gas on multiple occasions, concealing the true extent of its leakage. To Ekholm, this was proof of deliberate deception. He gave an ultimatum. Unless a new balloon was procured, he would not return. The glow surrounding the project dimmed rapidly after the failed campaign of 1896. Through the autumn and winter, André wavered, times ready to abandon his dream, at others burning with renewed determination. Then, in the spring of 1897, salvation arrived in the form of Alfred Nobel, who contributed financial backing just in time. Ekholm departed, unwilling to trust the balloon again, but volunteers were plentiful. André selected Knut Frankel, a 27-year-old civil engineer and outdoorsman, to replace him as meteorologist. When the new team returned to Danes Island in early July 1897, they were delighted to find both the balloon house and the hydrogen plant had survived the Arctic winter intact. Better still, the winds now blew from the desired quarter. The gloom of the previous year lifted in an instant. On July 11th, with everything ready and a strong southwesterly at their backs, André sent one final telegram to King Oscar and another to the Stockholm paper that held exclusive rights to the story. At his command, the ground crew loosed the ropes, and the Eagle, with its 3 passengers, began to rise and drift out to sea. Yet almost immediately, trouble struck. Overladen, slowed by its drag ropes, and barely buoyant, the gondola skimmed just a few meters above the waves. Within minutes, a sudden crosswind carried it off course, the basket bouncing violently on the whitecaps, threatening to sink. Inside, the men were thrown about as if in a storm. In the chaos, several of the crucial drag ropes snapped away. Strangely, what should have been disaster became a blessing. Freed of the extra weight, the balloon gained lift and steadied. After all, if they fell into the sea, steerage would matter little. Even that desperate lightness was not enough. The 3 men scrambled to heave out sandbags and whatever equipment lay within reach. Within only minutes of leaving the ground, they had jettisoned nearly 1,700 pounds of gear. Without that frantic sacrifice, the Eagle would likely have plunged into the sea within sight of land. Unburdened, the balloon began to climb steadily, reaching an altitude of nearly 700 feet. It gave them a margin of safety, yet with cruel irony created another problem. The height exceeded the balloon's design, and the thinner air caused hydrogen to escape all the more rapidly. Still, only hours after leaving Danes Island, conditions were calm enough for André to compose 2 messages, seal them in buoyant mail canisters, and cast them into the sea. The next 10 hours passed uneventfully, but as the hydrogen continued to bleed away, the following 42 hours became a nightmare. The balloon was hammered against the water again and again in violent crashes. For nearly 2 days, the men scarcely slept, constantly throwing more supplies overboard just to keep aloft. Disaster compounded when a thin glaze of ice formed around the balloon, adding weight and sapping lift further still. Predictably, on July 13th, barely 2 days after departure, they were forced to land. By fortune, the final descent was gentle rather than catastrophic. With no way to replenish hydrogen, the 3 were now cast adrift on the ice. At least the soft landing spared them injury, and much of their equipment survived intact. Though in dire straits, they consoled themselves that a rescue mission must surely be on its way, given how ill-fated their launch had been. The balloon had also carried carrier pigeons, each capable of bearing a plea for help. At least 4 were released, but only one ever reached human hands, alighting on the deck of a Baltic fishing boat. Its message, dated 2 days after they had left Danes Island and just before they were forced down, came to light far too late to save them. Now, more than 500 miles north of Svalbard, the men salvaged what they could and took stock. Though much gear had been sacrificed to the sea to keep the Eagle airborne, most essentials remained. Rifles and ammunition, sledges, tents, skis, the frame of a collapsible boat, and a significant reserve of provisions. One of Andre's shrewder decisions had been to pack extra food in the very ballast sacks, using it as counterweight. In the short term at least, hunger would not be their undoing. Roughly a week after the crash, the party camped in their tent, sorting baggage and debating their course. By then, even Andre conceded that reaching the pole was impossible. The obvious alternative was to march for one of 2 supply depots laid in advance. They believed that a search party might already have been dispatched that summer, but the Arctic Ocean was still largely frozen. Any rescue would need to approach overland. Their best chance, then, was to reach a cache and wait. The nearer depot lay on an island at the northern tip of Svalbard, southwest of their position, but they elected to head instead for the cache at Cape Flora, far to the east, which promised greater stores. What they did not realize was that their maps were flawed. In truth, Cape Flora was the farther of the 2, and in the opposite direction from their point of departure. Nevertheless, they pared down to what they needed for overland travel. On July 22nd, they lashed nearly 400 pounds of supplies to each sledge and set out, their goal some 460 miles distant. Very quickly, they found the sledges impossibly heavy and the ice far from level. Like a fractured glacier, the surface was split by crevasses and ridged with hummocks as high as 2-story houses. The overloaded sledges bogged down constantly, sometimes sliding into cracks and plunging into icy water. Hours could be lost hauling them out, the men collapsing with exhaustion and suffering snow blindness under the relentless 24-hour sun on white ice. Within a week, they were forced to halve their loads, abandoning much of their food. From then on, hunting seals, walrus, and polar bear became a matter of survival. They pressed on as best they could, but after 2 weeks had covered barely 60 miles. By early August, the truth was plain. They could go no farther. They resolved to turn back toward the Svalbard depot. Bitter irony followed, for their maps had never truly pointed them toward Cape Flora in the first place. Still, they estimated the other cache might be reachable within 2 months. As summer ebbed and the ice broke apart, they launched their boat across stretches of open water. At times, fortune smiled. They managed to kill seals, walrus, and even bears. Yet conditions changed daily, sometimes hourly. By mid-September, hope of ever reaching their intended goal was gone. The brief Arctic summer was closing. With winter returning, they made the choice to settle temporarily on a drifting floe. They built rough shelters from blocks of ice and adapted to a new routine, chronicling their days with Strindberg's rescued camera. Both Andre and Frankel faithfully noted positions in journals and logbooks. The floe drifted swiftly southward, and Andre dared to hope it might eventually carry them within reach of a whaler or sealing vessel. But in October, disaster struck again. Their floe fractured beneath the camp, forcing them to flee to a nearby island. Strangely, Andre's journal from that moment speaks of good spirits. Strindberg's diary, however, increasingly filled with tender lines to his fiancée. Then, suddenly and without warning, Strindberg wrote for the last time on October 7th. The very next day came Andre's final entry. It was chilling in its banality, a simple note of gratitude that they were once again sleeping on firm ground. No warning, no hint of peril, only silence thereafter. For more than 30 years, the fate of Andre's Arctic balloon expedition remained an enigma. Searches were mounted, but as season after season passed with no trace, the world's attention faded. Eventually, it was assumed they had perished, their remains never to be recovered. Then, by chance, in August of 1930, a Norwegian sealing party, taking advantage of an unusual thaw in the Svalbard archipelago, stumbled upon a stray boat and a boat hook carved with the words, Andre's Polar Expedition, 1896. Further searching revealed a camp, the final resting place of all three men. Alongside their skeletal remains lay journals, scientific records, and equipment, remarkably preserved. The bodies and belongings were repatriated to Sweden under a joint Swedish-Norwegian commission, but when the corpses were cremated without autopsy, the true cause of death was lost forever. For decades, scientists, physicians, and historians have scoured the recovered writings for clues. Early theories ranged from murder by locals, quickly disproved as their stores and gear lay untouched, to death from diet. Their journals revealed heavy reliance on undercooked seal, walrus, and polar bear meat, raising the specter of trichinosis. Symptoms described chronic diarrhea, exhaustion, persistent foot pain. Chronics were consistent. Larvae were even found in the carcass of a bear nearby. Yet trichinosis rarely kills, and physicians noted the absence of hallmark signs. Lead poisoning from canned food or scurvy from lack of vitamin C have also been suggested. Intriguingly, after September 10th, Andre's entries grew sparse, the handwriting shaky and faint, perhaps failing eyesight, numbed hands, or a deeper sickness brought on by food. What seems certain is that Strindberg died first. The survivors interred him in a rock crevice to protect his body from scavengers. Based on tears in his burial clothes, some now suspect a polar bear attack, one that may have killed Strindberg outright and left Frankel wounded. Soon after the burial, Frankel too succumbed, his corpse later found in the tent, lacking boots or gloves. That left Andre alone, broken, desperate, and aware the end had come. He was found propped against a rock, with empty morphine vials at his side. Tellingly, he had carefully wrapped his journal in wool, straw, and balloon silk, preserving it for discovery. He knew he would not survive, but he meant his story to endure. The Andre Arctic Balloon Expedition departed Svalbard on July 11, 1897. The balloon fell back to Earth little more than 2 days later, on July 13th. For 3 months, the men struggled across the polar ice, leaving journals, photographs, and bones as their legacy. In the end, perhaps we shall never know the precise chain of events that claimed them. Their fate remains one of the great mysteries of exploration, a tragic tale adrift in the endless Arctic night. Number 3. The horrifying First Australian Transcontinental Expedition. Roughly 100 years after Europeans began to settle Australia, its coastlines thriving with growing cities and swelling populations, the vast interior remained largely uncharted, shrouded in mystery. In fact, at the time it bore a grim moniker, the Terrible Blank. At last, in 1860, an expedition was assembled to attempt the first journey from south to north across the Australian continent. They would soon learn why, even to this day, that harsh heartland remains sparsely peopled. This is their story, and as ever, viewer discretion is advised. It is difficult to fathom that only 160 years ago, most of Australia was still unknown country. In the 19th century, it was a British colony, with coastal regions, especially in the south, booming. The colony of Victoria was exploding thanks to the gold rushes of the 1850s, drawing immigrants from around the world in search of fortune. Yet the immense lands between the coasts remained an enigma, so much so that they were called the Terrible Blank. Not until 1857 did the idea of mounting a new expedition take shape. Victoria was then a mere 7-year-old colony, but it saw an opportunity to assert itself as the wealthiest and most ambitious settlement in Australia. In partnership with the Royal Society of Victoria, the colony's scientific community, 2199, the government formed a committee of 32 to consider whether such an expedition was worth undertaking. It took 3 years of deliberation, but in 1860, the Victorian Exploring Expedition was formally created with a mandate to illuminate the secrets of the interior. There had, of course, been forays into the wilderness before, but no one had yet traversed the continent from the southern coast to the northern, and the Victorians intended to be first. The committee set out many aims, with 3 principal objectives. First, to observe and record the terrain, climate, fauna, and flora with scientific rigor. Second, to identify lands suitable for grazing. And third, to trace potential routes for a transcontinental telegraph. During those 3 years, most of the committee's energy went into deciding who should lead, a decision that eluded consensus meeting after meeting, ballot after ballot. There were 3 leading candidates, yet a result was not reached until 2 months before departure. On June 20th, 1860, a vote was taken and a leader chosen, and, remarkably, he was not among the 3 explorers previously considered. In fact, the man selected was not an explorer at all. The choice was Robert O'Hara Burke, who had no experience in expedition leadership, surveying, or navigation. Born in 1821 in County Galway, Ireland, he had served as an officer in the Austrian army, rising to lieutenant. In 1847, he returned to Ireland as a policeman, then emigrated to Australia in 1853. In Victoria, Robert joined the police force and rose quickly, eventually becoming a district superintendent. While these credentials hardly qualified him to command a transcontinental expedition, they did suggest he could command men. George Landels was appointed second in command, his most important contribution being the novel idea to use camels. At that time, camels had been in Australia for barely 2 decades and were still rare. A horse dealer in India, Landels had traveled widely in the Middle East, where camels were essential to life across unforgiving deserts. Hearing of the expedition, he wrote to the Victorian authorities in 1858, proposing to import camels and offering his services to manage them. Comparing Australia's climate and terrain to those he knew, he persuaded the government to hire him. Though not an explorer in the classical sense, he was known for experience moving through remote country. The committee then added William John Wills, an Englishman, as third officer. Wills had arrived in Australia in 1852, first working as a shepherd with his brother before training as a surveyor from 1855. The last 2 officers were Germans, Dr. Hermann Beckler and Ludwig Becker, half appointed to conduct scientific research on behalf of the Royal Society. Once the officer corps was fixed, a call for volunteers went out, and no fewer than 700 men applied. Burke conducted cursory interviews with about 300 of them, but in the end selected only those he already knew, disregarding many with valuable skills and knowledge. With the party assembled, the men gathered in Melbourne for firearms practice and camel care under George Landels's instruction. The city erupted with fanfare, staging farewell banquets and public ceremonies for the expedition. Yet behind the pageantry, tension already simmered among the ranks. Conflict arose again and again, most of it fueled by alcohol. 2 men were expelled before departure for drunkenness, and on August 20th, 1860, a third was dismissed for the same reason. With 3 positions vacant, Burke simply plucked 3 bystanders from the crowd and enlisted them on the spot. On the day of departure, an estimated 15,000 spectators packed Melbourne's Royal Park, ISC, some to honor history in the making, others merely to glimpse a camel for the first time. Burke and his men did not disappoint. This was, after all, the most expensive expedition in Australian history, and the extravagance was evident from the outset. Though numbering just 19, they hauled with them wagons carrying some 20 tons of supplies, rations for 2 years, 6 tons of firewood, and 50 gallons of rum. The last item was not intended for the men at all, but for the camels. According to Landels, rum was thought necessary to keep weary animals moving and warm during the winter months. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Melbourne's mayor delivered a farewell speech, reminding the men of their duty to endure hardship in the name of knowledge. Then, leading the crowd in 3 cheers, he signaled the wagons forward. But the grand send-off collapsed almost instantly into chaos. First, a camel broke free of its handler and charged into the throng. A nearby horse panicked, throwing its rider and shattering her leg. 1 wagon broke down before completing its first circuit. 2 more splintered within 5 kilometers, rendered useless. Matters deteriorated so quickly that Burke halted the caravan barely 7 kilometers outside Melbourne, ordering camp for the night. It was a short, humiliating beginning, and it exposed a problem no one had anticipated. August in Australia was the depth of winter, cold and sodden, utterly unlike the hot, dry summers of Europe. Camels, though famed for endurance, were ill-suited to mud. Around Melbourne, roads were slick and boggy, leaving the animals floundering. Horses fared no better, their wheels mired again and again. Conditions proved so dire that by the second morning, Burke abandoned the entire wagon train, instructing the teamsters to catch up later. It took them 20 days to do so. By September 11th, less than 1 month after departure, the expedition was already strung out and faltering. Burke slashed his numbers, ordering several men to remain behind with the promise he would send for them, though in truth it was simply a way to lighten the load. To offset the loss, he compelled the scientists to take up tasks meant for the absent laborers. Only after marching duties were met could they attempt their scientific assignments. In effect, Burke forced them to abandon the very purpose for which the Royal Society had commissioned them. He also forbade them from riding horses or using carts, ordering that they march on foot. The expedition had set out with 27 camels and 23 horses, yet their deployment was baffling. Landells insisted the camels not be burdened early on, reserving their strength for later stages. Some horses pulled wagons, but the rest could easily have been ridden. Still, Burke denied the two doctors, also the oldest men in the group, any use of them. Personal belongings were capped at 30 pounds, which every man had to carry himself. If these orders sounded absurd, it was because they were. They were little more than Burke's tactics to drive the scientists out. Despite clear instructions from both the Victorian government and the Royal Society, Burke cared only for reaching the northern coast and securing the immortality he believed awaited the first man to cross the continent south to north. Such measures did nothing to ease the bitter rivalry between Burke and Landells. From the start, their relationship was fraught. What vexed Burke most was Landell's insistence on hauling vast quantities of rum for the camels, a temptation many men could not resist. The breaking point came when they reached the Darling River. Landells argued that the camels should be ferried across in flat-bottomed boats, but none large enough was available. Burke ordered instead that the animals swim, assigning William Wills to lead them through the current. When Landells publicly challenged his authority, their partnership collapsed. Before Burke could dismiss him, Landells resigned. Witnessing Burke's contempt for expertise, Dr. Beckler followed suit. Burke promptly elevated William Wills to second in command. Weeks later, on September 23rd, the expedition reached Menindee, a settlement then of scarcely 6 huts, the last outpost of civilization before the terrible unknown. What is most astonishing is that the road from Melbourne to Menindee was hardly uncharted wilderness. Mail coaches traveled it routinely, completing the journey in about 2 weeks. Burke's expedition, by contrast, took nearly 2 months to cover the same ground. Still, upon reaching Menindee, Burke established a supply depot and made the tiny settlement his temporary headquarters. In direct defiance of the Royal Society's orders not to split the expedition, he once again divided his men. Convinced that fewer numbers meant greater speed, he chose only the fittest men and strongest animals to accompany him toward Cooper Creek, leaving the rest behind with the bulk of the supplies and wagons. During 5 days' rest at Menindee, Burke met a local named William Wright. Wright offered to guide them more than 300 kilometers north to the Torowado Swamp. Burke accepted, and with Wright plus 6 chosen men, he pressed forward. Despite poor weather, their progress was surprisingly rapid. In just 10 days they reached the swamp, seeming to prove Burke's theory that fewer men move faster. Yet much of that success may have owed to Wright's exceptional bushcraft and navigation. He became so indispensable that Burke formally enrolled him into the expedition as third in command. At Torowado, Burke gave the men a choice: return to Menindee with Wright, or push north with him. With spirits high and progress good, all elected to continue. After a short rest, Wright turned back alone, carrying orders to bring additional supplies and wagons to Cooper Creek. When pressed for a timeline, Burke's only reply was, "Soon." Weeks later, on November 20th, the advance party camped near Cooper Creek and spent a fortnight surveying the region. A new depot was established, and Burke waited 10 days for Wright. Wright never came. Impatient, on December 16th, Burke chose Wills, John King, and Charlie Gray to accompany him further north, leaving the others near Cooper Creek under the command of William Brahe. Before departing, Burke instructed Brahe to wait 3 months. If they had not returned by then, Brahe was free to withdraw to Menindee. And so the final 4 pressed on. For Burke, Wills, John, and Charlie, this was the decisive leg. Their goal, the Gulf of Carpentaria. Success would mean, at least in Burke's eyes, the completion of the expedition and their place forever in Australian history. But to reach the Gulf, they first had to cross the Stony Desert, a vast expanse of shattered sandstone, eroded over millennia until only the hardest fragments remained, forming a barren plain of gravel and stone. At first the men were pleasantly surprised. The desert was not as broad as they had imagined. This gave them false confidence that the worst was behind them. By January of 1861, they met their true test. Rugged mountain ranges that strained men and beasts alike, camels faltered badly on the steep inclines, and the descent offered no relief. Then came the rains. The black soil plains near the Gulf turned into quagmires, while other regions drowned under floodwaters. Travel became torturous. Exhausted camels sank and stumbled, finally collapsing altogether. Burke, impatient as ever, ordered a halt on one of the few dry patches of land and split the party yet again. John King and Charlie Gray would stay with the animals, while he and Wills made a last push toward the coast. Strangely, after fewer than 25 kilometers, they began to smell the salt of the sea. At last, it seemed, their ordeal might end. Yet the shoreline was barred by an endless wall of mangroves, dense, tangled roots and branches rising from the water, impenetrable without boats. To push through meant wading chest-deep, entangled in roots. With crocodiles lurking in the northern rivers, it was impossible. And so, after all their suffering, they turned back without ever setting foot on the shore. In the days that followed, the four men dismantled their camp, discarded all but the barest essentials, and began the long march south toward Melbourne. But the rains clung to them into March, dictating each day's progress. Some days they managed barely a kilometer, others none at all. After a month, they had only just cleared the mountains. Torrential downpours forced them into a cave, where their last firewood grew sodden, leaving only a feeble flame, insufficient even to cook. When they had left Cooper Creek, they believed their provisions enough to reach the coast and return. In truth, 2/3 had already been consumed before they turned back. Now the rations were dangerously thin. Even on schedule, it would have been a crisis. Delayed by weeks, it was ruinous. One night in late March, Charlie killed a snake more than 2.5 meters long with the heel of his boot. The men devoured it, but instead of relief, Burke succumbed to dysentery, an affliction spread by tainted water and food. Diarrhea, fever, cramps, vomiting. The symptoms were brutal, though not yet fatal for a man of Burke's constitution. About the same time, Wills caught Charlie stealing flour behind a tree. Confronted, Charlie confessed, and Burke's response was swift. Accounts differ. Some say Burke merely slapped him, others that he beat him so savagely Charlie feared for his life. From that point, discipline collapsed. In the following days, they slaughtered 3 of the 4 camels for food. By April 10th, even the camel meat was gone. The last to fall was Burke's beloved horse. 6 days later came the final blow. Charlie Gray was found dead in his sleeping bag, most likely from starvation. Meanwhile, months earlier, at the end of January 1861, Wright and the long-delayed supply party finally left Menindee. To him, 3 months meant the literal passage of that time, and so his departure came far too late. Their journey fared no better than Burke's. By the end of April, 3 men in Wright's group were dead of malnutrition. Back at Cooper Creek, William Brahe had remained faithful to Burke's instructions. 3 months passed, but he lingered another full month just to be certain. By this stage, 3 separate parties existed. Burke's men struggling back from the Gulf, Brahe waiting at Cooper Creek, and Wright advancing from Menindee with the overdue provisions. On April 21st, Brahe at last decided he could wait no longer. He buried a cache of supplies beneath a tree, carving into its bark the words, "Dig 3 feet, NW, April 21st, 1861. Then, with 6 camels, 12 horses, and most of the remaining food, he led his party south toward Menindee. The tragedy is cruel. Only 9 hours after Brahe departed, Burke, Wills, and King staggered into the abandoned camp at Cooper Creek. Surveying the site, they discovered the cache Brahe had left. Inside was enough food to sustain them for perhaps a month. More haunting still, the date carved into the tree was the very same day they arrived, proof that the 2 groups had missed one another by the narrowest of margins. Yet Burke believed they could never catch Brahe's retreating column. He concluded their best chance lay to the southwest, some 240 kilometers away, at a place ominously named Mount Hopeless. Along the way, he hoped to encounter the Yandruwanda, Aboriginal people known for their hospitality. Before leaving Cooper Creek, Burke buried a letter at the base of what history would later call the Dig Tree, recording their change of plans. But he carefully disguised the disturbed soil so no one would guess the ground had been touched. 1 week later, on April 29th, As Brahe traveled south, he encountered Wright's supply party. Guilt weighed heavily on him. Feeling as if he had abandoned Burke, he turned back with Wright to Cooper Creek. On May 8th, they arrived and inspected the dig tree. But because Burke had so carefully concealed the burial, the ground looked untouched. Believing nothing had changed, Brahe left again. After waiting several more days with no sign of life, Wright and Brahe departed Cooper Creek forever, FTEA, back to Menindee, and then Brahe continued to Melbourne. Meanwhile, Burke, Wills, and King had left Cooper Creek but managed little progress. All three were too weakened by hunger to march far. By late June, Wills was failing rapidly. He begged Burke and King to continue without him, to seek help from the Yandruwanda. At last he lay down and died where he had been left. Days later, Burke too succumbed X-wide, exhaustion and starvation claiming him, leaving John King utterly alone. Nearly a year after the expedition had left Melbourne, the Victorian government dispatched a rescue mission northward, with Brahe among them. In mid-September, they met the Yandruwanda, and to their astonishment, they found John King still alive. Adopted by the tribe, he had survived long enough to tell of Burke, Wills, and Gray, all dead. When the rescuers brought him back to Melbourne, the city was shaken. An official commission of inquiry was convened, tasked with unraveling the disaster from the day of departure to the final deaths at Cooper Creek. Its report was damning. Burke was condemned for splitting his expedition not once but twice, for failing to keep a proper journal, and, most critically, for leaving his subordinates without clear written orders. That last failure sealed their fate. Had he given Wright precise instructions instead of the vague phrase, "soon," provisions might have reached Cooper Creek in time. And had Wright possessed greater competence, the cache would have been waiting, almost certainly saving Burke and Wills. Yet the commission's closing remarks softened their judgment. For all the missteps, the expedition had still given Australia a debt of courage and sacrifice. Burke and Wills's bodies were returned to Melbourne, where they were interred with the first state funeral in Victoria's history. And that is the story for today. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you receive a notification each time we release a new one. 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 Time we release